Hi guys, my name is Ashley Garcia, and today I'll be presenting on the Baroque period, which is from the 1600s to the 1700s. So, what were the roles in gender at the time? Well, the roles here were very traditional and meaning that the husband or father were the ones that held authority over the wife and children, and leadership roles in the community were exclusively reserved for men, whereas women were able to be only in control of the household, and their only job was really to nurture the children and have the household in control. Women were seen as daughters, wives, or mothers. They were not their own person. They were basically seen as a additional entity from the husband, not their own individual. And there were virtues of innocence and morality for women that they had to follow. So, in cultural and societal norms, marriages were often arranged by the relatives and parents as strategic alliances, not as acts of love. And then daughters would stay with the family until they married. A married couple was seen as a single identity and controlled by the husband. Any property was considered the man's. The only case where it wasn't seen as the man's property is when a woman would be widowed. If there was no one else to take care of the land, then that land would go to the woman, and that's about as much freedom that they had. Divorce was not a common thing, so these partners would be for life. Economy and education. So there was global trade going on at the time that brought new fabrics such as silk, lace, and cotton, and new wealth to Europe. Upper class men were the most educated. Even if you were an upper class woman or a royal woman, you would not receive that much education, if any, because it was honestly looked frowned upon. It was frowned upon, and they really thought there was no need for women to be educated, as again they were seen as additional aspects of a man, not as their own person. And then here's the interesting part: merchants became upper class because of the trade going on. So merchants used to be more local, more on a smaller scale. They would be, very local. But now, because of the increased trade and imports, they rose up to the upper class, or at least upper middle class, and they became bigger companies in a sense. And there was just a lot of trade going on at the time, which caused these changes, even in fashion. And then obviously we have our royals and our monarchies going on at the time in Europe. Developments to fashion. Religion played a part in fashion, as Protestant and Puritans emphasized modesty, and they were against vanity, which led to simple, darker garments with higher necklines and minimal ornamentation. However, the Catholic Church was the one that put a little bit more emphasis on wealth and the nobility, which caused the usage of rich fabrics, deeper colors, dramatic silhouettes, and more heavier ornamentation. There were sumptuary laws, for example, in France, that controlled who could wear certain fabrics or certain type of fabrics, such as certain types of silk and how much lace you could wear. And then it also controlled colors. For example, the harder the dye was to make, the richer you had to be. So deep reds, deep blues, deep greens, and then purple was reserved for royalty. And in England, Puritans also had their own sumptuary laws in where they enforced modest dress codes. Not only did religion have a play in these new emerging styles, but so did politics. For example, in France, King Louis XIV centralized fashion control at the Versailles court. In England, royalist styles decreased and Puritan simplicity increased because of the English Civil War. Spain was more conservative and had a more somber aesthetic with stiff and dark garments. So again, the Silk Road opened trade. Silk was being imported more from China, lace from the Flanders, and cotton from India. And this is where really women's gowns included fitted bodices, full skirts, and elaborate lace details, as there was a new addition of the fabric and availability because of the trade being so high. But silk was always seen as a luxury fabric that only the wealthy could wear. And cotton was a fabric that was more commonly used in undergarments as it was breathable but still durable. Developments to fashion. The wealthy really distinguished themselves here in this era because they wore silk, velvet, excessive lace, and they had metallic threads woven into garments. Also, the usage of colors such as deep reds, blues, golds, and emerald greens. Clothes had detailed embroidery patterns, pearls, and even other jewels embedded into the garments, into the fabrics. And then stiff skirts and tight bodices that were being worn at the time by the rich that restricted their movement basically showed off that they didn't have any need to perform any type of physical labor, that they could afford to wear things that restricted that movement, took away that movement, because in the end, they didn't have to. So visual art at the time, it was very highly ornate and in a dramatic style. There was dramatic colors, rich textures, drapery, and layers. It emphasized emotion, movement, and meaning. There was a very intricate detail in clothing, and some famous artists at the time were Paul Rubens, Michelangelo Caravaggio, Artemisia Gentileschi. And basically, these paintings highlighted the human. As you can see, it all looks as if it was stopped in time and captured almost with a photo, but it was a painting and it really expressed human emotions. It was very focused on contrast. For example, we could see the light and shadow contrast, and that would even add a deeper meaning to the painting. In architecture, there is that same dramatic and theatrical techniques inside of buildings. There was still heavy ornamentation, such as statues and illusion ceilings. There were hidden windows inside to illuminate altars and domes. So they really played with light and darkness contrast here. The buildings and what's inside was usually made from imported and expensive materials such as marble, gold leaf, and gilded bronze. Even though this was all for the higher class architecture, for the more expensive architecture, the architecture from the lower class was smaller with more affordable materials. And there was still that element of ornamentation. There was still that element of decoration, just that it was less complex and it was mostly focused in one area. It wasn't around the whole building as it is in richer areas, but they still tried to keep the same dramatic themes, just in a smaller scale. Music, there was a dramatic spirit and stylistic diversity of the Baroque music. It featured contrast between loud and soft notes. There were new vocal forms in music, expressive melodies, a clear distinction of secular and sacred music because of those added vocals. So the vocals would really decide which music was more secular, like for more entertainment purposes, and which music was sacred for the church. Some composers were Johann Sebastian Bach, Antonio Vivaldi, and Claudio Monteverde. Some ending thoughts. Because women were expected to dress highly and as a reflection of their husbands, there was a excessive display of wealth with fine fabrics, structured and layered silhouettes, as they were trying to show out to the world that they were rich, that their husband was rich. The global trade, as a result of the global trade, there was an increase in luxury and expensive imported fabrics, which overall increased people's wealth. Sumptuary laws caused a clear distinction between higher and lower classes. And in art, it really mimicked the silhouettes of the time because there was so much human focus, and there was always contrast of light versus dark. For example, in visual art, there was always contrast of darker colors with lighter colors, or like lighting and darker lighting, as well as in architecture. There were places that were highlighted and emphasized, illuminated, like altars and domes, with the use of darkness as well. And in the music, there was also light and dark sounds, which is pretty cool because everything of the period almost seemed to be dark with a little bit of illumination, if that makes sense. And the contrast of rich colors in architecture and paintings mimicked real life style choices of the ornamental and jeweled and overall elaborate garments. And for my presentation, these are the references that I used. So thank you so much, and that's it.